I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Building a Lab of the Future, Scientific Blueprints for Your Data Ecosystem. Today's presentation is presented by Riffyn. They are a partner of Astrix, and we are pleased to have them with us today. So before we get into it, we can go to the next slide. We'll tell you a little bit about who Astrix is and what we do in this space. We are hosting basically a webinar series that's bringing thought leaders from around the R&D and the lab informatics space together to present their thoughts on where the laboratory of the future is going. But as far as who Astrix is, we're an informatics professional services and strategic outsourced solutions company dedicated to servicing the scientific community. A couple of quick stats about Astrix before we turn it over to our friends at Riffyn. We were established in 1995 and are privately held and originated as the IT division of a company called APBI Life Science, which was a research organization. We operate from 7 offices in the United States in beautiful Costa Rica, and our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey. We support Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, chemical, CPG, government, and research institutions, all typically with large and fast-growing IT, outsourced, or compliance needs. And our mission has and always will be to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions for the scientific community. We go to the next slide, please. And as far as the solutions, where we come into play when companies are looking to modernize their lab, or bring their lab into the the future, the cloud, what have you. Our role in this is early on, we work with laboratories during the business process and analysis and enterprise architecture phases to help them figure out what their right technology architecture should look like based on their unique needs and their unique setup and their unique life cycle stage. From there, we can go through and help with laboratory selection services. We can help to develop and implement software. And then, of course, because this is regulated industries, we can help perform the computer systems validation. At the end of this, we then provide services that can help to maintain and manage your systems, and we can even staff those laboratories with technical and scientific professionals. So with that, I want to take a moment now to transition and introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Loren Perelman, who is Vice President of Scientific Solutions at Griffin. His professional background is he's been with Griffin now since 2018. He's been the Director of Quality Analytics and Manufacturing at Bolt Threads from 2014 to 2018, and he's been a Senior Scientist at Amyris and a Group Leader of Analytical Services at Nito Denko. His educational background is an MS and a PhD in Material Science at the University of California, San Diego, and a BS in Chemistry from Harvey Mudd College. So with that, Loren, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to your capable hands, and I'll come back on at the end.
All right. Thanks so much, Kevin. And before I get started, I just want to thank Astrix for hosting us today, as well as the audience for joining us. I'm actually going to start by inviting you to yet another meeting. We're very excited about this. We're launching a Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series at Riffyn, and our inaugural instance is with Dr. Zaman, and I think it's a fairly apropos topic in today's era, talking about pandemics. So if this is of interest to you, please join us on March 2nd. You can find information on our website, and we'd love to see you there. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in and start by talking about a concept that's near and dear to our heart at Riffyn, which is the idea that science is driven by blueprints. And I'm going to start with sort of an inductive proof of sorts. Riffyn really focuses in biotech and biopharma. That's not to say we don't work with other industries. We've done work in a fairly wide-ranging array of arenas, including things like materials processing, ceramics development, food formulations, and so on, small molecule chemistry. And I think this instance is a good example of what's happening across all of these industries. And the idea is that modern science is happening across a wide swath of technologies. Looking at the biotech industry, it all starts with basic science and then moves very quickly into a development space, which ranges from screening processes to a whole bunch of different development activities, ultimately landing at process qualification, transitioning into tech transfer, and if we're successful, landing in manufacturing. And so in this example, we're looking at, in biotech, everything from cell line development and its associated screening to analytical and bioassay development to support measurements across the entire spectrum. If you're in the biopharma world, certainly formulations and DMPK and tox in vitro and in vivo are really critical. And quite a bit of upstream, downstream, and formulations process development happens. And putting this all together with a bow, we land at process performance qualification. And what's happening here is it's exceedingly multidisciplinary. It takes a lot of steps to get this right or wrong. It's technically demanding. Each one of these verticals has its own challenges. It's like its own microcosm unto itself. And it's complex. If I pull a string in any one of these areas, it's going to have impacts everywhere else. So demands that come from downstream PD are going to echo into upstream and even as far up into cell line development. So it's important to understand this in a comprehensive sense. So what is a blueprint for science? We define that as the source code to a scientific process, or in other words, the flow of materials, equipment, and so on through a scientific workflow. And it provides change control on process. It's a traceability and a historical perspective that acts sort of like the GitHub of science, kind of like GitLab, but maybe a little more involved than that. And it's a map of what data gets captured. In a sense, it's a heuristic for what your data model is going to be. And thus a network of functional diagrams of process. And because of that, it's a mechanism for putting it all together. It's explaining the rules for joining and structuring. And I think one of the goals, at least at Riffyn, is to reduce or eliminate the need for extensive data engineering. And so I've included a screenshot from an upcoming version of Riffyn that highlights how we're approaching this in our software Nexus. You're looking at a version tree with branching nodes and meta information on those versions. And then we'll get into this in just a moment, the process flow diagram or the blueprint for this process. So the hypothesis is that everything is a process or a flow. And I wanted to break that down into the various stages of the scientific process. It starts in R&D with protocols, experimental descriptions, and material flow between units. And so this is pretty well defined. It's a structured activity. Granted that there's a lot of flexibility and maybe I dare say art happening at the same time, but it's anchored in a sense by these defined subunits. When we transition over to process development, tech transfer, and manufacturing, it sort of matures into process definitions, process scale-up information, the associated plant design, which is literally a blueprint, and recipe management, which are data blueprints and process blueprints for executing batch production. And finally, even in the data structure, the data engineering, there's a blueprint that's defining how data sources interact with each other, which ultimately pushes your ecosystem. How do your primary sources link to different elements like LIMS or ELNs or process data systems? You also have to take into account how the user is going to interact with the system. So as a system of engagement, the user experience. And finally, the punchline here is we're doing all this science to ultimately solve a problem, to understand something, to perform analysis. And we really strive to create access for that analysis because the belief is a product, a physical product, a drug, a material is a byproduct of excellent scientific process and associated data management. And so born out of these concepts is our company, Riffyn. And I'm showing a picture here. And this is a plant in Brotas, Brazil. Both our founder, CEO, Tim Gardner, and I and myself previously worked at Amyris. And these are 3 of 6 200,000 liter reactors that were carrying genetically engineered yeast that turned sugar into a designer oil called farnesene. Amyris was founded originally on a Gates grant to make artemisinic acid for anti-malarial drugs, but quickly transitioned into biofuels. And if you remember the cost of gasoline around 2007, 2006, it was quite high. And so this was the dream, to convert farnesene to farnesane and conquer the biofuel market. And it's not to say this didn't come out with a number of challenges. I think there's some folks in the audience as well who lived this alongside us. This ultimately broke a number of records and limits in the world that people said couldn't be broken. So, what was the magic that drove that? And what was the inspiration ultimately for Riffyn? Well, first and foremost is that process and data quality is the foundation of machine learning. That large-scale data aggregation of high-quality experiments enabled correlations that delivered gains in manufacturing, cost-free in this case. So what we're looking at here is a pretty typical graph maybe of a single experiment where I'm studying some property like yield as a function of some parameter. And this is sort of my worldview. And maybe over the course of a project or over a short time period, I'll aggregate this to see some part of the picture. But ultimately, I'm looking through a keyhole to understand a much bigger problem. And so when I aggregate all of that data across hundreds of experiments, I'm able to see a much higher degree of correlation that was totally unexpected. This ultimately, in this case, unearthed a critical model of yeast physiology. And when we combined that model with a physical model of the reactor, it predicted that if you add just a bit more water to the reactor, you get more product. And it worked. It led to 5 to 10% gains in productivity. And if you want to see a little bit more about this story, you can go to jump.com to see the jump forward talk that Tim Gardner gave. The problem was that at the time, the traditional data systems and practices were failing us. It was not easy to come by that aggregated data. A big part of the challenge is that data integration was not implicit. That's something that was hard fought. But on top of that, process context is not often delivered alongside measurement data. We're very keen on the materials we make, not as good about capturing the data, the information, the process that got us there. And that's really needed to drive machine learning and AI, the stuff of future data analysis. And these are a few examples here in the center of some stories from the field, multiple companies. In one case, it's taking a global pharmaceutical company 2 to 3 months to assemble data from a single development batch. And in that time frame, you're losing ground. You're not making decisions because you don't have a picture yet. And in the center is a picture of a process at a company. This is how people are communicating their processes, trying to perform root cause analysis. And this is, I would argue, perhaps woefully inadequate for doing that sort of thing. And ultimately, we end up changing what we know and not what matters because we're not looking at the picture holistically. We haven't mapped it completely. So the lab of the future seeks to avoid these pain points because it's that fragmented, unusable data that impairs insights. What does that mean? Well, it's siloed lab data. Different groups approach data capture differently. It can become very challenging to assemble that data together. And this rears its head in a variety of ways. Perhaps one we all know about is like a sample gets transferred to an analytical measurement team and they change the name for their internal group system, and then it becomes untraceable. We don't actually know where that sample came from. And so there's that lack of traceability. There's data scattered in a variety of formats, be they Excel, CSV, multiple databases that aren't connected together. And so you're ending up spending an enormous amount of time performing data wrangling. And this is due to all the aforementioned problems and non-standard language that makes it difficult to couple it together, or non-standard structure of data and what have you. And on top of these problems, you're lacking experimental design information. It's just not in a structured format that lends itself well to performing subsequent analysis. And so you're missing critical context. So the goal here is to fix these problems. It's to make that data usable to generate new values and insight. Capture those process parameters, materials, samples, time series data, standardize data formats so that they can be coupled together, standardize naming so that you understand the flow of materials through multiple verticals of process. We want to enable enhanced data capture, so improve and provide rigorous tracking of data across the lifecycle, and integrate data sets from multiple sources into a single data frame, which lends itself to more powerful data analytics. We want to empower machine learning, and we want compatibility with standard business intelligence tools. So it all has to work together. And finally, it's great that we have this structure, but it needs to remain flexible because work is happening aggressively at the same time and people aren't remaining static. So processes are constantly changing, they're growing, they're dynamically adjusting to reflect what's being learned. Enter Riffyn Nexus. This is our flagship software that addresses these problems. You might have guessed that. It's a process data system, which is a new concept. Rather than being focused on samples or experiment design, it's focused on the process flows, the blueprints that you use to arrive at your experiments, to perform your experiments, to make your materials. And as a consequence, it delivers integrated contextualized analysis-ready data nearly instantly, and ultimately leads to improvements in process quality, better screening decisions, and improved process performance as a result. So to kind of visually place this in the pantheon of various solutions, Nexus is sort of the child of LIMS and ELN. It exhibits properties of both, but ultimately it's neither of those things. It's its own unique beast. So LIMS tend to be more sample-centric. They tend to be on the static side. They lack the flexibility, but they provide an enormous amount of structure. ELN, on the other hand, are extremely flexible. It's kind of often, we term it as paper on glass, but that might reduce the structure a bit. And so at Riffyn, we're focused on a process-centric view that couples the flexibility of ELN, the ability to modify on the fly, with the structure of LIMS to produce something new. And this is backed by 6 issued patents and 3 that are pending. This is a screenshot of our user interface. What we're looking at in the upper center portion is a process flow diagram, in this case of a protein A chromatography process, and it's broken down into individual steps. Each step represents a material or information transformation. You have inputs and outputs. Inputs are things that I have at the beginning of a step or information that I know, and outputs are things that I make and information that I learn. On the far left side, we're looking at the versioning panel. This is the current version, and as I showed you earlier, and we'll show you again, we're updating that dramatically to be more like a GitHub style approach. And on the right, we have procedural information. And when you're in execution mode, that also enables capture of text-based comments, file uploads, and so on. And I'll point out that in this procedure tab, you're also able to upload rich media files. So things like videos that highlight a component of a procedure, templates, pictures, and so on, and users can directly interact with those in the procedure tab. So how does it work? Well, first you start with the process design. So you map the process, and that can be done as modular or as fixed as you'd like. So there's no need to commit to a very specific flow. You could build individual sub-processes and tether them together. And then you enter data via experiments, and it consumes data from a number of mechanisms. You can, of course, manually enter data. We have onboard parsing capabilities that enable upload of Excel, CSV, and structured text files. We can integrate directly with historians with our data agent. And we have a full RESTful API that enables a great degree of automation, script interaction, and so on, which allows you to pull from any number of primary sources into Nexus. So you execute and capture that data. And Nexus is contextualizing and aggregating data across multiple experiments and across time. So even as you adapt, change properties, change materials that are on a step, Nexus keeps those linked and contextualized. So if I add a step or remove a step, I'll simply add or remove data from a column. So if experiment 4 had an added step, all of the experiments tethered together will have columns for that step, but only experiment 4 will have them. And ultimately, this structured data enables more rapid analysis because you have your data on demand, and that can be plumbed to your data analysis tools. And I'll stress that that's done externally with Nexus, and that was a deliberate choice that recognizes that there are a number of options on the market for performing analysis. We weren't going to get into that game and try to compete with the likes of Jump or Python and so on. And so what we are producing is vendor-agnostic data in a structured format that lets you process it however you'd like. The core capabilities of Nexus include process context, so process and experimental design templates, as well as inventory of all your materials, equipment, reagents, and so on. It enables data capture. These design templates allow material tracking across linked process steps, across linked processes, and throughout a product lifecycle across time and space, and enable data acquisition from a number of modalities that were highlighted earlier. And it feeds to a data analytics platform. So again, analysis-ready data frames for machine learning and visualization. We have an API and we have SQL access capabilities. So you can access from any platform of your choice. And we routinely make custom analytics dashboards. My team does this for folks. We work with customers to define what user stories are most valuable and then deliver pre-built automated analytics that support that user story. And it's exceptionally flexible and compliant. We've talked about the process versioning. We're also 21 CFR 11 compliant, enabling GXP activities, and Riffyn is ISO 27001 compliant. So all of this automation and aggregation enables insight. This material traceability and process context leads to structured and integrated data that leads to dramatic time savings and novel insights from correlated data. We have a number of examples of Nexus out in the field. We're finally seeing results drop in. We've been at it for, I think, about 5 years commercially now. So a number of use cases popping up on our website. At Novozymes, we've helped them accelerate their work to deliver strains to market twice as fast as they ever had before. We've helped customers execute their assays with 25% less effort, reducing groups of 10 by about 2 FTEs per year in terms of requirements, enabling them to do a lot more. In the fermentation space, we've seen up to 20x faster data prep because that data is always integrated and ready for consumption. We worked with Imperial College of London to develop a pooled COVID assay that took 9 weeks from start to clinic deployment. And you can read more about that. We worked with a solid dose formulation group to save them time on every single batch. And in the animal testing world, we were able to reduce their testing requirements by 80%. So we're seeing very real impact. And I invite you to visit our website. All of these stories are available in much richer detail. And it's really exciting to see the impact of how delivering data in a process context is leading to vast improvement to workflow. I want to present an example. This is a delivery that's just wrapped with an enterprise customer of our platform. And I think in the next couple months, we'll be able to talk about who this is exactly. But for now, we're going to keep it anonymous. So at the core of what they were doing was a fairly standard biotech workflow that ranged from molecular biology strain engineering into a high throughput screening and enzymology platform. So they're an enzyme-driven company, into fermentation at various scales, leading to downstream process and final formulation. And of course, in any of these processes, we have analytical chemistry throughout. We constructed for them a number of analysis tools to support rapid visualization, rapid dashboarding. In the strain engineering space, and I'll show an example of this in a moment, we developed QC dashboards for all of their library generation activities that fully automated that process and saved the team dozens of hours per library generation. So they're doing that multiple times per year, saving hundreds of hours. In the HTS and enzymology space, we built them heat map and selection criteria, visualizations, and analytics platform. In fermentation, this is really neat. We built them a dashboard builder. So it's not a dashboard itself, but the ability to make their own dashboard. They select what parameters they want to visualize, what data they want to tabulate, and then it produces that dashboard for them. So it provides them flexibility based on the experimental question to make a product that suits them best. Over in downstream process, we made dashboards that do your standard metrics in that space, recovery, yield, purity, and so on, as a function of unit op and as an aggregated concept. And then in the analytical chemistry space, developed their control and performance charting capabilities and also gave them a core process builder. So one thing Nexus enables that's really helpful for our clients is you can build core templates that then get modified but remain linked to that core. So a lot of analytical chemistry involves plate-based workflows, HPLC-based workflows. So to develop a new HPLC-based workflow, for example, they take that core process, they modify it to reflect whatever that exact process requires, and then they can deploy it, and it plugs and plays directly into this control and performance charting capability. We also worked closely with the customer to develop some pretty high-level integrations and custom applications that go beyond just visualizations and dashboards. So they have an in-house plasmid and DNA design software capability, and we've integrated with that, which means that all of their genetic materials are available as materials within Nexus, and when they design an experiment, the inventory is synced between the two databases. In the HTS and enzymology space, we've developed a plate-based workflow manager. So users can work through a web-based platform to design their enzymology and screening workflow, and then it builds the associated process in Nexus. And then they're able to consume data off of that executed process to visualize, compute, and analyze. And ultimately, they made the decision to use Nexus as their strain management database. And so all of their strains, both working strains and promoted strains that are part of their permanent storage, are contained within the Nexus database. In fermentation and downstream process, we integrated directly with OSI Pi. And so they're pulling time-based continuous data from those processes into Nexus experiments, and then able to pull that data out into visualizations like these dashboards that we've highlighted prior. And in analytical chemistry, we've developed some automated data upload tools. And so this is an example of one of the dashboards that was built for the biology team. This is a site-specific mutation library generation process. And when the users are done, they assess the mutagenesis pipeline for efficiency and diversity. They're able to log into JUMP, indicate which experiment or which library they're interested in learning more about, and it automatically pulls the data out and produces this dashboard that contains the overall rate of site-specific mutation uptake, the distribution of specific amino acid modifications in all of their mutants, and diversity calculations. And like I said, this is saving the team about 20 hours of time per library, which is going to lead to hundreds of hours of saving per year because of the number of libraries that they're making. So how does Nexus fit into an R&D IT ecosystem? Well, first and foremost, it's critical that you can get data in and out of Riffyn quickly. Through the UI, you can manually enter data, you can copy paste, so it provides a spreadsheet-like entry, looks not unlike Excel, provides the ability to put fill down formulas in, and we've also added a number of validation features that allow you to provide valid options to indicate whether or not values lie within spec limits and whether they are within a specific range of a target value. We also have a parsing agent that allows import of files. So from things like HPLC exports, plate reader exports, and other spreadsheet templates. And the UI also enables a vendor neutral CSV file export. So you can pull that into your platform of choice. We have an API that allows connection to any source that can talk to the outside world. And that means that you can add data from applications and automate your lab. You can overlay custom user interfaces. You can sync data to and from applications, from databases, and you can push data to and from lab automation systems. Also allows you to update records for transfer to external systems. So push data to a data lake, write data to custom analytics pipelines. And then you can also push data in a Parquet format as well. And then, as I indicated, for historian or relational type databases, you can connect using our data agent. So this is a small piece of code that creates an encrypted tunnel between Nexus in the cloud and your local database or another cloud database, and allows you to pull data from historians, LIMS, ELN, and other custom-built databases. What we're really aiming for with Nexus is to place well within your data ecosystem. So this is really a recognition that there's no one solution for everything that you're looking for. And I know there are a lot of us saying that there is, and I think our experience out in the field is that people try that and they ultimately rely on some more specific types of approaches than a single vendor can provide. So we're really looking to act as sort of the spoke, if you will, of the wheel to capture the process design, to enable experiment execution, to provide design tools like ontology and versioning, and track across multiple iterations of those. And we want to plug and play with external reference data systems like ontology databases. We plug and play with master data and molecular design. So we're not trying to be a molecular biology design platform, but we're built to integrate directly with them and consume, much like the example I showed earlier where we have integrated with the customer's DNA database. And that could go much farther into more holistic inventory, database metrology, control systems, equipment inventory systems, and so on. We can also connect to primary instrument data capture systems. There are a number of mechanisms for doing that, ultimately through the API layer. And then we have examples where data from Nexus is being ported into data lakes to be assembled with other high content data, things like next generation sequencing, image analysis, and so on. And of course, as we've highlighted a number of times, really the goal is to push this data in its structured format into analytics platforms, enabling machine learning, visualization, and so on. So the overall value props here is that we're providing a robust process data system that allows you to track sample creation, materials. It's integration and automation ready. It's built to do exactly that. And meanwhile, it's providing this process-based backend that allows you to track across your process development lifecycle. Additionally, it's compiling all of your data, putting together process conditions, online instrument data, offline data, at-line data, enabling you to structure things like comments and associated metadata directly with all of that data. And that enables comparison across sites and research groups in a global organization, because this can be shared instantly and directly with all users as you choose. And ultimately, again, it's resulting in analysis-ready data for use in the software of your choice, enabling things like root cause analysis and design of experiments. So I want to wrap up with the future of Riffyn and Nexus, where we're headed as a company, as a platform. This isn't an entire roadmap per se. It's just a couple choices of things that we wanted to highlight today. So I showed you this earlier. This is really lending itself to the process lifecycle management concept that Nexus is aiming for. So this is our upcoming versioning system. On the left, you're looking at a core branch of version with sub-branches coming off of it that organizes all of your experiments and versions into a single container for subsequent download and comparison. On each of those processes are a variety of metadata, and between processes, you're able to do differential analyses as well as compile experiments and sync the different versions into new comprehensive versions that take the additive total from the two different versions into a new one. And so this will allow people to work in a draft mode for a period, develop their processes, kind of go through the standard process development lifecycle, keep tabs on everything that changed, and understand the impacts of those changes across time in a very deliberate way. Where this is all leading to for us is creating a digital pathway from R&D to the manufacturing floor. So Nexus is really centered on late stage research, process development, pilot development, and ultimately tech transfer. And so you're looking at the left here is your standard process development process, where you iterate through versions until you have one that is ready for transfer. And the vision here is to provide a mechanism to transfer the Riffyn Nexus process as a recipe into your manufacturing execution system. So we have several active partnership projects happening right now that enable conversion of Nexus processes into S88, S95 conventions that can then be absorbed into your MES and batch execution systems. And then the data from those runs can be pulled back into Nexus to live adjacent to the research, process development, pilot, and tech transfer batches that you created. And that enables a holistic model of end-to-end scale of your process. And the hope is, and the goal of multiple companies, is to be able to take that data and inform the next tech transfer. So perhaps you do less batches at the pilot scale, less iterations in process development, and accelerate yourself to market faster. And so this is a reflection of the current state of that R&D to manufacturing digitization, where you have ELN sort of in an unstructured space supporting basic science, moving into LIMS, as we highlighted, fairly inflexible and perhaps lacking in context, into MES, DCS. These tend to struggle with recipe design. And what's unmet here is the process documentation capabilities, the process lifecycle management piece, and some of the reference data that helps stitch it all together. So system to system correlations of those types. What we're aiming to do is provide that digital backbone from R&D to manufacturing. So again, we're looking at that same spectrum, ELN, now moving into Nexus. So we recognize that there's still a value to ELN for doing your very early science activities. That's not going to be replaced because that requires a hyper flexibility that Nexus isn't necessarily built for currently. But this ultimately Nexus replaces your LIMS and your PD-based ELNs, and it's built to integrate with workflow automation, with data acquisition automation, inventory, and so on, like I showed on ecosystem. And as we highlighted previously, enable that digital transfer. So Nexus is the CAD, computer-aided design, that goes into CAM, the computer-aided manufacturing system. And we're ultimately striving towards the process lifecycle management space. So with that, I'll thank you and take any questions you have.
Hey, Loren, it's Kevin.
Hey, Kevin.
Hey, I'm sorry, I lost my connectivity there for a minute. It appears I just got it back. Were you wrapped up?
I did, yes.
Great. Sorry about that. Listen, if I do cut off again, it's just because we're in a really bad storm where I'm at locally. So if my internet just kind of glitched out of me, but it just came back on. So anyway, if I cut off, it's just because of that. We've gotten through all the content, which is great. So let me go ahead and we'll get the recording all stopped up here, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So thanks for your patience there. So bear with me one sec, folks, and we'll get the questions up that we have on the floor. All right, first one, how does Riffyn coexist with existing ELN in the lab? Does it replace it? Does it plug into ELN data, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we tend to coexist. And so ELN has its place in the early research phase and can often be used for workflow activities like molecular design and materials registration. So designing plasmids, designing DNA, designing molecules, stuff like that. And then via API to API or API to SQL type connectivity, Nexus can consume the information in those ELN, provided they're in structured or semi-structured format, and logs them into the Nexus inventory. The problem it's solving beyond that is that you're then going to take those materials and do things with them, and ideally develop a number of processes that take into account those materials and associated workflows. And so we provide the capability to do that after the design portion.
Okay, great. How do you envision integration with Tacit data sources that hold analysis and conclusions, often in Word documents?
It's a good question. Yeah, so Nexus allows you to directly attach files of those sorts to the associated experiments and processes. So upon completion of an experiment, you can use Nexus as a database to store those. And we're actually, though I didn't talk about it, we're working on expanding some of those ELN-like features that capture those sorts of concepts. And so I think our vision is that you can already use Nexus to do those things, and it will continue to provide expanded tool sets to make that experience even better.
Great.
And I'd say, thinking about that, actually, I want to expand on that a little more too. If you have a fixed data source, it's pretty easy to use Nexus as not only a material flow source, but an information flow source. And so you build a connector process, for example, that links the raw data from experiments to your summary database. And so we've done things like that, and we're doing things like that. For example, where we integrate different model databases into Nexus. So you have your raw data and process definition in Nexus, and then maybe capture some of the result meta information, but then ultimately connect to a database that stores all of your model information, or in your case, it sounds like summary reports and files and so on. So there's several ways to skin the cat, so to speak, on that one.
Gotcha. Okay. Appreciate that. So let me. I think there's a follow-on to that last question. It says, at what level do you see instrument integration? Are you working with Allotrope?
We do work with Allotrope. That's an active engagement. I think instrument integration and automation is core to most mature or maturing implementations of our system. And so we're constantly creating those types of integrations, exploring new ways to do it, either directly with our customers or through third-party services that they utilize.
Okay. Just checking to make sure you're still hearing me, Loren.
Yep.
All right, great. My audio has been calling out a few times since you've been talking, so I'm kind of skirting on the edge here. All right, how do you see integration with and providing context to large image files, linking the images to lab data?
Yeah, so currently the way we manage that, pragmatically, we provide for hyperlinks in Nexus experiments. And so the way we tend to do that is if there's been image process data associated with an image and upstream process, we can consume that quantitative information into a Nexus experiment and then provide a link to the image. So, storing in something like a SharePoint or a local database, you can click and it will open that directly in a separate tab.
Great. I think we'll do two more questions. How do I even start investigating or evaluating a digital tool, and what do I need to know about my own organization first?
It's a great question. I think first thing you want to do is map the pain points, understand what it is you need out of a system, and perhaps most importantly is understand where you're going with the system. I think we encounter a lot of people who are looking at what the next year or two look like, and they're focused on immediate needs. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's right. You want to solve a problem that you have currently. But from experience, both personally within the workspace and working with other clients, you learn that you quickly outgrow solutions. You have to really think robustly, like for the next 5 to 10 years, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? I think it's safe to say companies invest in R&D to make products, so you're ultimately going to end up in manufacturing. And you really want to identify either with internal personnel or bring people in who can help you identify, like Astrix, what that road's going to look like, and then let that guide the definition of the solution.
Okay, great. Let me see here one sec. All right, last question. How is Riff and Nexus different from an ELN or a LIMS?
Sure. Well, I'm going to repeat myself, I'm afraid, but I'll do it anyway. Yeah, so I think the core driver there is that we really put the process first. So when you're looking at a LIMS, for example, you have to define your database schema up front. You have to create vessels into which you pour data, so to speak. In Nexus, it's you define a process, and that is the data schema. That is the data model. And you can adapt that at any time, and it automatically updates based on those changes. So I would say that's the way it's fairly distinct from LIMS. It's similar in that it allows capture of structured data that could be downloaded and used in a structured format. So that's something LIMS is particularly good at, with the caveat that Nexus automatically joins information based on material flow and the connections that you build between steps and processes. It's different from ELN because it provides two handles. One, it's highly structured based on that definition, and I think LIMS require a fair degree of configuration to get to that level of structure. Nexus is sort of out of the box, ready to structure things for you. It also provides the data engineering component implicitly in itself. And what we see often from ELN is there's a fair amount of back-end engineering required to couple the data together, join it together, and display it in a meaningful format. And if you don't have that sort of capability in an organization, or you don't want to invest in expanding it, Nexus can solve that problem for you.
All right, great. Am I still coming through okay?
Yep, I hear you great.
All right, cool. All right, well, I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap. If we didn't get a chance to get to all questions, we'll certainly do a direct outreach to you individually, so we can respond directly to your questions. And again, that'll happen over the course of the next day or so. So with that, first and foremost, I want to thank our speakers today. Loren, great job, obviously. Very in-depth presentation from our friends at Riffyn, and keep a heads up for the email that'll come out with the recording. And Riffyn and our friends from Riffyn, I'm going to give you guys a minute here if you want to have a closing statement before we wrap up. Go right ahead.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Guess I'll just add, we'd really love for you to follow up with us. We have a website with a lot of rich information about case studies, a lot of opportunities to engage. I would invite you also to our LinkedIn page to learn about upcoming events. We're constantly giving talks, presentations, and participating in the scientific community at large. And I hope to see you at our upcoming event with Merck. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you very much. The session's now complete. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks a lot.